Hello all, and now I wanted to do a two-for-oneer, if you will, since the Dewey video ran a little bit long. I usually don't like to go, over 30 minutes. Um, so we left off with critiquing, pragmatist thought really with regards to abstraction and, following a set, doctrine or principles and descriptions of problem situations in a way, whether you want to debate whether it's a more concrete method. Of course, that's that's a different conversation, I suppose, or a different way of looking at it. But I did want to hone in on the natural philosophy, because I think we could tie in an introduction to what existentialists are going to have to say, and some of the critiques of pragmatism as one of the first real postmodern and post-metaphysical in that sort of way of truth and foundationalism, which is constantly going to be critiqued from here on out with regards to people like Descartes. And that's certainly going to be the case with Kierkegaard, as we're going to see. But one of the things to say really, though, is there's no real, of course, certainty in pragmatic thinking. Of course, they're not really interested in that to begin with. But without that certainty, causal mechanisms within the scientific method, then, such as for the example of if I got wet right now, does that mean it's actually raining outside? Does that ensure that there's always going to be rain every time I get wet? Of course not. There's many different ways for someone to end up being wet that doesn't require the mechanism of being rained on outside at any given time. And so you don't really have that sort of certainty towards any of these mechanistic functions if they are merely situational or just instrumental. So the consequent is logically fallacious, quite explicitly, actually. There's only really that you can have the probability, I suppose, but there's only that probable sense of truth. With regards to one of the things that is, I think at least, admirable about pragmatists and Dewey in particular, is seeing human relations as not just that atomistic form of individual speculation, but as a rather more of a communitarian sort of relational being, a social being in that sort of Hegelian sense. I do quite like that about them. But as we've pointed out in past videos, of course, there really is no actual values intrinsically in the universe to the naturalists. It's all simply our own creation. But in a way, though, this sort of way of doing situational ethics or problems in politics is an atomistic way of looking at this in itself, because situational beliefs is really described in Dewey's case as particular situations that are apparently different from each other, but in a way this is just re-identifying with the atomistic view of human relations as a whole. Situations can have an abstraction that we can relate to. There's situations in life that every human being is going to face. And that's certainly the case with, existentialism, which is what I'm trying to bridge in, of course, too. And so there's universal problems, even on the biological, way that human relations are seen with, the evolutionary process with the pragmatists. Problems and desires in that biological function, we certainly would be able to, form concepts out of, the same problems in a philosophy of life in that universal way. And so if you have, questions of the meaning of life or being itself that need to be answered in that sort of capacity of what is, the good life, if it was, as opposed to just simply what is desirable in these outcomes or these probabilities in a situational way. And so I think that is really how I want to put a bow on pragmatism and introduce existentialism, with questions of the meaning of life and these universal sort of situations, if you will, with regards to living in a post-industrial world, and what does that mean in a phenomenological methodology towards describing dehumanization, alienation. What is it? What is the self-conscious that's self-aware in the industrial world? And so existentialism, in a way that isn't like other, philosophical schools or logical systems that we've gone over, existentialism is more based in concerns and a consciousness that I don't think really would have happened, or at least it would have been a far different way of conceiving it without the technology and techniques, as Spengler would say, with regards to these concepts of alienation, of existential dread, of a world that's with relations that are rotten and aren't really necessary in that way that Sartre certainly looks at sexuality and that sort of masochistic relationships with certainly that sort of tradition of Hegelian dialectics as social beings, and the master and slave dialectic certainly comes to mind there as well. So the focus of attention isn't in logical schools of thought for the existentialists, and certainly not on trying to abstract an essence of human nature, but it's of the existence of self-consciousness and the sort of description of what an authentic experience and meaning is. And that's also really interesting too, is existentialists are very much concerned with things like an authentic experience. And I think that really does show that technology and or even capital, I suppose, and if you want to look at how Marx, who was a contemporary of Kierkegaard, they're both answering existential questions in their own way of alienation, whether it's to be a good Christian or to sublate your own values and onto the world. But that sort of discourse on authentic experience, I think that technology, there's something embedded within it with regards to how things don't really seem to appear as they really were before that technology was introduced. Certainly you could think of life before the latest piece of technology, and yet you can at the same time. I think that's something that really would resonate with millennials in particular, who had that sort of mixture of different childhoods, of not being so interwoven on the digital sphere as compared to the real world, and seeing how that those kind of worlds close, as Heidegger would describe it. We'll see. And so I think that authentic experience and meaning for the existentialists is quite interesting in that regard. So descriptions like qualities of anxiety and dread, these are always things to be considered, things that are going on before we even consider a sort of reasoned proposition, or as Sartre would say, an existence without essence, even before we can get towards the essence. Those sort of qualities of dread and the problematization of being itself sort of presupposed in a way before our essence. And so descriptions and illumination of the mess of existence we find ourselves in, and trying to uncover what we truly are afraid of and fear out of life. Of course, that is one way of considering quite explicitly what each existentialist will have to say. But on the intellectual level, there's always just with regards to this as an ideology that arose out of particular technologies that might not have happened before. We also have to consider that on the intellectual basis, of course, in this sort of philosophy of history here. And so existentialists are greatly influenced by the likes of Hegel and Kant, and their influence over these existentialists. You can see that Kant's Copernican, and sort of the world is conformed by what we bring, in that sort of inward creation or capacity to the world, those categories of thought that go into the human psyche. And so Sartre's big work on the transcendental ego, the self-capacity and structures of thought into the world, certainly is something that the existentialists are going to focus on if they're going to also presuppose things like anxiety or that sort of self-awareness of your own death, quite literally. With regards, of course, with Hegel, you'll see the dialectic, the unfolding self-consciousness, though, for Kierkegaard, which is rather interesting to see. He clearly has a problem with the way the dialectic goes about, reason and the intellect being, that next level, as opposed to, the feelings and, those existential qualities as actually being, in a way, more genuine than simply, rational beings. You can clearly see, of course, that we've gone away from, rational beings or having some sort of, creative capacity and romanticism. Now it's the opposite. We're definitely not rationalist beings for the existentialists. So Kierkegaard's very indebted to emotion and feeling, and trying to describe that. And clearly Hegel's a phenomenological method of that description is influential, and his way of the existentialists are more or less concerned with freedom and reprise of either these anguishes of emotion or alienation in that sort of technological sense. How can we still get towards freedom? And Hegel, of course, is his history of trying to achieve absolute freedom in history. That might not be the case here with in the historical sense, but there definitely is that freedom of the self that Sartre and the postmodernists are certainly going to be interested in with regards to the 20th century. Existence to essence, or being in that sort of way towards becoming, for Heidegger, mere existence, or Vorhandenheit, as we'll described, is the object on hand. There's no inward identity. It's simply that sort of mere existence, and for Dasein is that there, or that is, which we'll get into more later with regards to the existence and essence. But one of the things, of course, that's worth counting for with the existentialists is, since this is a philosophy mainly of concerns and not of proposition, then you're going to have a very interesting group of people who will refer to them, or even walk away from titles such as existentialism. With Gabriel Marcel, that certainly was the case. He referred to himself as a philosophy of existence. He was a Catholic, French one, he very much had a disposition for the the non-theological existentialists, and so he refers to a philosophy of existence, and we'll look at his repudiation of Sartre a little bit later. You have Tillich and Buber as other theological existentialists that could be interesting to look at. And then, of course, famously on the other side, you have Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre as more or less the irreligious dichotomy. And I think, one of the things that's interesting, perhaps less in a discussion on, what philosopher was religious or not, but more into the giving of oneself. Sartre is certainly going to talk about the transcendental ego, and you'll see his, there's no synthesis for Sartre, or there's no meaning or purpose to any of this, whereas you can see with other existentialists, the giving of oneself, going beyond oneself, actually, is the way that they see enlightenment, or truly, actually, being in the world, quite literally. And you can see, of course, with Sartre, with being and nothing, and there's no discussions on love or commitment to any sort of relationship towards God, or even one's people. That certainly isn't going to come up very often, and that's why his dialectic, lien soi, nien soi, if I'm saying it right, in itself, and le pour soi, for itself, world as for me versus world in and of itself. And you can see, of course, with that Kantian influence there, the transcendental ego of seeing the world as you see fit, and the world for what it actually is. But in the end, of course, if it's only referred to in the self, you can see why Sartre would say that there actually is no synthesis in this world. Or there's, in regards to No Exit, his famous play, it's the antithesis without a synthesis that's presented. Whereas we talked about with Marcel. He has a play called Man of God, which also features three characters in a similar way. He describes, we have to live for others, and God giving of oneself for a meaningful relationship. That would be his synthesis. And now I wanted to perhaps adjust and hone in on the first thinker that we're going to really discuss, and this is because we want to kind of go in order with the schools of thought here, and that would be with Kierkegaard, even though his influence didn't come until much later, certainly with the 20th century. And I think you see the resurrection coming again, really, with the evolution of the internet as a whole. It seems a rather reoccurring theme in the last century or so, that you get this reoccurrence of existentialism every time there seems to be more technological capacity that is unfeathered, in that sort of radical changing of society. Certainly in the last 2 years, you would argue that there has been objectively such a shift in how society will operate going forward, or with regards to things that are simply just not going to come back from the prior. But so with regards to Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard's main thesis and really what he wants to hit home in his pseudonym writings is becoming a Christian person, which that is to actually become a person is to become a Christian for Kierkegaard, and that's his real thesis that you'll see throughout his works on how, despite existential problems, how despite feelings and rationality, or even structures such as the church that he famously would feud with, how despite all these things can you still become a Christian? That's Kierkegaard's thesis. But one of the interesting themes you'll see is his critiques of Enlightenment and Romanticist account of being. He clearly isn't a rationalist. He doesn't see that sort of rational human conception or a rational being, or even externally driven or filled with that romantic sort of creative spirit or guidance. It's much more in that sort of finding yourself through the dread, as opposed to a romantic account, or that even reason is the way that is your way out. Reason, the rational, in his critique of Descartes, the rational doesn't actually have a starting point. And so if you don't have a starting point, Kierkegaard is going to suggest that logical abstraction is never going to suffice for an individual, because of course an individual is a particular, and each individual has unique circumstance, unique qualities to them, and since the rational has no logical starting point, in that sort of subjective sense, then you can't. There's no way to quench it. There's always something that's changing. Certainly, with regards to situational ethics at the start of this video, there's never any content or sufficient way of going about perhaps faith or relationship to God. It's always going to be constantly reevaluated and constantly reaffirming or denying in changes towards properties of the world or data at any given time. The rational is always moving. And it can't ever really tame questions of faith. And so for Kierkegaard, he's really focused on the two paths forward for being a Christian, is the objective path and the subjective path. And both of them, of course, have different properties and qualities to them in that relationship towards God. The problem with the objective path, the objective truth, is that it cheats us out of the passions. Experiencing love, or that sort of hopeful drive or emotion. There's a lot of things that could be said about simply instrumentizing, results. But what about the actual experience described as, what that actually means to strive towards something? That passion that doesn't necessarily come on an intellectual basis. A lot of the things that we truly love and are provoked by, or even protect us, when, if you've ever had a really scary incident in a car, a close encounter, or even a car crash itself, there's always been that impulse that I've noticed that really actually will, hurt a lot of people, of, shielding your loved one, putting your hand still, even though, you have airbags or whatever, there's still a lot of people who, have that impulse to just, shield a loved one, in those situations. And that's sort of, that's definitely not on a rational basis, but you see that sort of passion and that love that exudes out of you and provokes you, even if it could cause you pain or something like that. And that's a path or an experience that confides to many beings or many different people. Not everyone is 140 IQ and sitting around and being a Spinozan and having an ethical system towards the world in an objective way. A lot of people are guided more by the passions and faith. And so the subjective response is the passion and love to give onto Christ and God, rather than the logical systems to actually prove a God. And so that really is the two paths that, and two ways that Kierkegaard sees experiencing God or Christianity in that objective and subjective sense. It's important to not see it as sort of a discussion on relativity, but more on his way of actually describing relationships and passions as compared to the logos structure. But this is a 2-in-1 video to finish up Pragmatism and also introduce the various existentialists, as well as starting to get into Kierkegaard, which we will be doing fully in the next video. But make sure to subscribe, and thanks for watching. See you for the next one.